The following is a Shaw Public Affairs presentation.
Kevin Falcon is going to find that being Minister of Finance is not nearly as much fun as being Minister of Transportation or even Minister of Health. Everybody's going to be after him for more money, and he's just not going to have enough.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer and our Finance Minister is on the show tonight. Finance Minister, Deputy Premier, Keeper of the Cash Box. How you doing?
Doing great, Vaughn.
Yeah.
It's enjoying myself.
You are, eh? Even
Yeah.
with this HST thing over your head every day?
I'm living the HST dream, Vaughn.
Well, it seems to me that you were the first person to say it's one of the worst handled public policy initiatives you'd ever seen in your life.
Yeah, and it's true, and that's what frustrates me. I think we did just the worst possible job on introducing that tax and not explaining it to the public at all, and then stood by and had the heck kicked out of us for months and months and months, quite understandably and correctly, and now we're trying to get it right. And it's a lot of catch up to do, but I intend to be the way I always am, which is frank up front and just give people facts and hope that we get an informed decision.
Can it be saved?
I think it can. I think it can if we don't try to oversell it and we don't try to undersell it. We just give people the facts. I always have said, Vaughn, and I really genuinely believe this, that the public's a lot smarter than most people ever give them credit for. And if you give them information, don't try and oversell it, just give them the facts, allow them to sift through it. They'll listen to both pro and con sides, battle it out. My only obligation is I just want to make sure they have the basic facts. If I've learned one thing through all the telephone town halls where I have had literally tens of thousands of people talk, listen, ask me questions, one thing I know for sure, we have facts. We got a lot of work to do to get basic facts and information out to the public.
You got questions on this in the House all week. You've got an advertising campaign of some kind coming from the government. Mm-hmm. What's going to be the tone of those ads? What kind of things are you going to say?
Really informative, Vaughn. The kind of information that I think the public needs to know. For example, 80% of consumer spending remains unchanged with the HST. In other words, when we had the PST and the GST, that's 7 plus 5 equals 12. And on 80% of consumer spending, it doesn't change. But on 20% of consumer spending, there is now an additional 7% PST. That's what happens when you harmonize. I want to be as upfront as I can with the public about that. Let them understand that that's the additional cost that they're paying, but it also helps support, balancing the budget and supporting important social services like healthcare and education. And just being upfront, I want to make sure they have those facts, other basic facts, so that they know that basic groceries there's been no change under HST. Gasoline, there's been no change. Home heating fuel, no change. That kind of basic information is important so that when the public votes, at least they're voting having the basic facts, and if they decide to vote against it, that's okay. I just want to make sure that people understand what they're voting for and what they're voting against.
When are we going to see the ads, and when are we going to know what they're going to cost?
Vaughn, right now we're having to really scramble, as you know, because we've moved up the date from September the 22nd. We've now moved it up to the end of June. So I am trying to put together as quickly as I can. It's going to be, it's not going to be a real slick effort, obviously. It's going to be, put together fairly quickly. But I'm trying to put together an information campaign. The moment I know what the lockdown number is, I'm going to announce it publicly. I'm going to be very upfront about that. And I want to be clear, I'm completely unapologetic about the fact that I'm doing this, because I really believe I have an obligation as a finance minister to make sure that the public has the basic facts right when they go and vote. Because I don't want to hear after the fact. I don't want, a single parent with 3 kids coming up and saying, why am I now losing $1,000 a year that I used to get in HST rebates as a result of going back to PST, and now I get nothing. I want to make sure that people know what that choice is so they can make an informed decision.
Talking to Finance Minister Kevin Falcon, and we're talking about the HST, obviously, and I'm going to get on to some more questions on that, including the report that came out this week. But I got to ask you, because you're a political junkie, your reaction on the federal election this week.
I thought it was good for the country, and I think it's good for British Columbia, because I think at a time where there's still a lot of economic uncertainty around the world, I think having a stable majority government is going to be a good signal to the international markets, the financial markets, to the business community. I think it will help lend some confidence in terms of there's not going to be big, huge shifts in public policy in Canada. And I think for British Columbia, it's helpful in the sense that they're a known quantity. You know, we know what we're dealing with the federal Conservative government. We've got some good relationships that we've built up, and I think that we can help work together to try and, create good outcomes for British Columbians.
We say there's a known quantity, but there's an unknown aspect of them, because I think two of the ministers that British Columbians knew best in that government both retired. Stockwell Day and Chuck Strahl, both retired. Who do you think is going to be our point of contact for British Columbia, BC government with the, I mean, there's usually a federal minister, but there's usually, we kind of hope we get 2 or 3 ministers in the new government.
Yeah, well, certainly it's a big loss. Stockwell Day and Chuck Strahl were great to work with, and they really did help us advance, British Columbia's issues of priority and help move those things along. But, we've got a great relationship with James Moore. I imagine he's probably going to be a pretty prominent player. John Duncan, of course, I don't know John quite as well as I know James. But there may be some more cabinet ministers
too. That's another.
And we lost Gary Lund,
yeah.
So there will probably be maybe 1 or 2 more cabinet ministers. I don't know, but whoever is there, we'll start working with them right away. We'll make sure that we're very clear and focused on what British Columbia is looking for out of the federal government. One of the things we've always tried to do, regardless of who the federal government is, federal Liberal, federal Conservative, we've always tried to be constructive, and I think that's paid big dividends for British Columbia when you sort of compare that to the 1990s and the hugely dysfunctional relationship that the NDP government had with the federal government at the time that, frankly, it not only didn't pay dividends, but frankly cost BC a lot.
What your reaction to the phenomenal showing by the New Democrats in the province of Quebec?
Yeah, well, it's actually, I'm going to enjoy this, to be honest, because I do feel awfully sorry for Jack Layton, because what he's got now is a whole bunch of elected members. Most, some are kids, college students that have never been elected. There's one 20-year-old girl that doesn't even speak French, and 97% of her constituents are French-speaking. I think the big challenge for Jack Layton is, how is he going to pander to Quebec, which he clearly is going to have to do with the huge majority of seats that he has out of Quebec, and how's he going to square that with the message he's going to try to send to British Columbians in the West? I think that's going to be very, very hard to do, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how he does that.
Well, I will say one thing, and I've had occasion to think this over, because I had the same reaction as you did. But I was thinking the other day, we're always talking about getting young people more involved in politics, and there is. I mean, it's sort of stimulating to think of 4 university students ending up in our parliament, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they may turn out to be the smartest members there, So I'd say give them a chance. Don't pick on them, but the some of the others, Well, I think the new leader of the opposition may discover why the Prime Minister sometimes asked his members not to say anything until they cleared it with him. So you can talk yourself into a lot of trouble in politics.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, and it'll be kind of fun.
So let's go back and talk about the HST panel. So we had a report come out this week, and I think we may be able to put a link up on the screen at some point so people can see it. But there's a report from an independent panel that looked at really one big question. Looked at the question that's on the referendum, and when you get your referendum ballot in the mail next month, and you get a chance to fill it in and send it back, you're going to find, and the question is basically, would you like to extinguish the harmonized sales tax, HST, and go back to the old provincial sales tax PST, in conjunction with the GST? And it's a question that was actually drafted by Bill Vander Zalm and his associates. At least it's framed the way they put it in their legislation. And that's going to be the question. It's interesting. It's not really a trick question, but if you want to get rid of the HST, you say yes. You don't say, no, I don't like it. You say, yes, I want to get rid of it. So that's the question. So the government appointed a panel And I'm just setting this up now. The government appointed a panel, and the panel came back this week. The report runs about 24 pages, and the report's called It's Your Decision, and it is posted on the government website. You can go and read it yourself. The people that headed the panel, former treasurer from Alberta.
Yeah, Jim Dinning, former treasurer of Alberta. Former Auditor General George Morfitt, highly
BC,
regarded
yeah.
from BC. The president of the second largest credit union in the country, Tracy Reddy's from Coast Capital, and also a public policy professor out of SFU who is also a former NDP MLA from Saskatchewan, which I actually didn't know until
John Richards.
Yeah, until I read into John's biography. So, you know, four eminent individuals for sure, and I think they produced an excellent report. I really do, Vaughn.
They said some things in there that surprised me given what the government had been saying all along. Here's one of them. You go back to last summer and the summer before, Colin Hanson going around as Minister for HST saying this thing is going to create 100,000 jobs. The panel said 25,000 jobs, so 1/4 of the previous claim. That's a bit of a come down.
Yeah, and you know, we got some criticism for that. So you've got, you know, Jack Mintz, who was the one that came out with the 113,000 new jobs number. The independent panel saying could be 25,000 new jobs. I don't know whether it's 25,000 or 100,000 or something in between. But what I do know, Vaughn, is that any new jobs are good for families. And any new jobs, you know, someone that gets a job, a high-paying job that allows them to support their families, I think is a good thing. And at the end of the day, I think if you look at the report, what I like about it is it's sort of HST warts and all. It's the pros and the cons. It lays it out very objectively, and it says over to you British Columbians. And I really appreciate that. And I think, and I hope, the British Columbians will go to the link and read it, because I think it's very balanced. And that's the best I think that we can hope for and expect.
It's pretty candid and well written. It's well written. It's also quite candid for a government report. One other thing that really jumped out at me, I think this is probably the newest and one of the most important new numbers in it, is it says that the government was actually going to make money on the HST. It was going to get, because the base for the tax is broader.
That's right.
Even after you take all the extra exemptions and all the rebates out, the base is broader. It says the government is going to take a hit of about $600 million a year. If we have to go back to the old provincial sales tax, that's going to strip $600 million bucks out of the provincial treasury. And that's
Annual.
on top of the money you have to pay back to Ottawa.
That's right.
So I'm just looking at the number for the first 2 years. It's almost $3 billion.
Well, that's right. And I mentioned that today in the House, Vaughn. And I don't want to be hysterical. I don't want to be over the top. I don't want to, you know, try and say to people the world's going to come to an end as we know it. But as I pointed out in the House today, you know, the leader of the opposition, the NDP, are going to campaign to say, let's go back to the PST. That's an entirely legitimate point of view. But as I pointed out to them, and you know as well as I do, you listen to Question Period every day, there is not a single question period that I can recall where they have not said government is not spending enough money in whatever ministry it happens to be. So they are going to have to explain how going back to a PST, which is going to take a hit on the provincial revenues just over a 2-year period of almost $3 billion, how they're going to square that with all the promises they're making and balancing the budget. It is a big challenge. Now, we will have to deal with that if that's the decision the public makes. And it's a legitimate decision. It just creates some real challenges financially, and we're going to have a difficult time managing them, but we'll have to do it.
The other thing they said, this is an interesting thing, they tackled the question of, could it be done? Could you go back? And how long would it take? They said, yes, you can go back. Let's put that aside. You could. People vote to go back to provincial sales tax. The province can do it. No province has ever quite done it in quite this way before, but you could do it.
Yeah.
But they said they talked to federal officials and provincial officials about how long it would take. And there's computer systems, there's tax collection cycles federally and provincially. You have to help business adjust. You've got to change laws federally and provincially. You've got to give business time to set up 2 tax collection systems again, or tax paying systems. They say 2 years. So if people vote, the votes will be counted roughly August, and they vote to get rid of the PST, it'll still be with us probably till the summer of 2013, 4 years after it came in.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm so glad they pointed that out, because I got to tell you, Vaughn, I heard Chris Delaney on the radio when we announced that there was going to be a mail-in ballot and that people would have up until July 22nd to get their ballot in. He was on the radio saying, well, this is ridiculous. Now people are going to have to pay HST over the summer. And it's like, okay, this isn't something you can get rid of in a week. And because the federal government has to repeal their own legislation, we have to bring back legislation to go back to a PST. And by the way, as you well know, there's 140 countries around the world that have harmonized taxes exactly like the HST. They call them value-added taxes in Europe. But there is no jurisdiction you can find anywhere in the last 35 years that has introduced a sales tax like the PST. It really would be going backwards, and not in a good way. But it takes time. We would have to rehire 300 tax auditors in the province at $30 million a year to, have to go through all the oversight and management of the PST system. But we also then have to say to the private sector, you've now got to scrap all the changes you've made in your computer systems and everything else and go back to having to deal with the GST and the PST. So, these are all not very fun choices, but again, we can work our way through those. You just can't do it overnight. It will take, as the independent panel correctly pointed out, up to 2 years.
One more number. During the lockup for the HST in 2009, Kevin Falcon was not finance minister then. I won't hold him accountable for this. We tried and tried and tried. The entire media lockup was an attempt to get one number out of the government. What would the tax cost families in British Columbia? Individuals, families. We wanted a number. We never got it. The panel has given us a number. And I think, to me, this is one of the things that really adds to the credibility of the panel, because it was very hard to get this number out of the government for a long time. $1.33 billion is what the panel says it's going to cost families, additionally, on top of what they're paying now, the move from the PST to the HST. That's a big number.
Yeah,
that's a big burden.
Well, and as they point out, for the average family, that means about $350 additionally per year.
Yep.
And that is true. And, I've said from the moment I became finance minister, I've been out there saying, I want to be clear, people pay more. And it generates more revenue to government, for sure, especially in the out years, and that number grows. And I actually think that's kind of important, because we have an aging population. I'm a former health minister, so I know where our healthcare costs are going, and they're not going down. And I do think we need a robust tax system that is efficient, that helps generate investment, that creates jobs, that's going to generate that additional economic activity that generates revenues, that helps us support those important services like healthcare, education, balancing budgets, etc. But we have to be upfront with the public. I don't want to pretend that there's not a cost. There is a cost. Now, one of the reasons why we're engaged in a listening exercise right now, as you know, Vaughn, I've had another telephone town hall meeting the other night, as did two of my colleagues, Minister Blair Leckstrom and Minister Pat Bell. They were doing them in different regions of the province. Together, all three of us listened and had over 78,000 British Columbians as part of these telephone town halls we're having. And we answered dozens of questions, and people that can't get through, because you have a queued question lineup of sometimes a couple of hundred people, and those that can't get through to us personally and ask the question can leave a message and have their question looked after later. But it is a great way to get feedback, because what we're saying to the public is this: we know that there's an additional impact. What can we do to ameliorate that?
Yeah.
What change can we make to the HST to improve it? And it's about listening. And we've committed, the Premier's committed, Premier Christy Clark, that we'll listen to that and we will come forward with a change. I don't know what that is yet, based on what we hear, to try and ameliorate that impact for families.
Yeah, I was thinking, especially after reading this report, the impact of untangling this thing is so bureaucratic and so cumbersome. Whether I was wondering if, with all this additional revenue, if the idea you floated during leadership, your run, which was to knock a point off the HST, to say to people, look, more stuff is being taxed, but we're cutting the rate for you. It wouldn't be cheap. It's about $800 million,
Yeah.
right?
And
So it's not cheap. But on the other hand, it struck me that that might be the kind of thing that people wanted to hear, partly because the one thing when you read the report, like low-income British Columbians are actually coming out ahead on this because
Yes.
you're giving them a rebate,
right.
right? And at the high end, everybody, oh, well, rich people, they can afford it, right?
Yeah.
Cabinet ministers, political columnists, they can afford it, right? But there's a bunch of people in the middle
Yeah.
that's $350 for a family is
exactly
a lot of money. And I just sort of wondered if maybe the tax relief, if maybe knocking a point off it might make it a little more palatable for those folks.
Well, and that's certainly one option, and that's an option that people can go to the website hstnbc.ca. We have an online survey, Vaughn, that allows people to go in, and actually that's one of the options, and to look at different options and state their preference. And we also, and I insisted this be done, that we also show what the estimated cost might be of each choice, because I don't want people to think. I mean, I would get people to say to me, "Well, just drop the rate to." Someone said that last night. Just drop it to 10%. Well, we have to recognize that is at least a $1.6 billion hit. And how do we do that? I assume people still want us to balance the budget, and they still want us to be spending increased dollars in healthcare and education, et cetera. So we have to be responsible. That's one option. There's other options. The Premier has said we're a family-first government. So we're going to look at the impact through a family-first lens and see whether that idea or other ideas that might reduce the impact on families can be looked at.
We will take a brief break on Voice of BC with Kevin Falcon. Stay with us.
I have to say I am absolutely shocked, though, to hear Premier Clark say that she will not be introducing a new budget. The reality is the old budget that they introduced back in February, the first week of February, only set for 4 days, was a budget that basically was a status quo budget. And what is a status quo budget? A status quo budget means it's a do-nothing budget.
Your source for in-depth, local political coverage. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
Crime happens, but where it happens and who becomes the victim can be influenced by you and your community. As the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, Block Watch programs assist police by reporting suspicious activity.
I'm witnessing a theft from a vehicle.
To learn more about crime prevention in your neighborhood, contact your local police department or the Block Watch Society of BC.
If you would like to contact us at Voice of BC, write to us. Our mailing address is 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2, or send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca.
What's your thing?
Bugs.
My thing's sound effects. Here's a T-Rex.
Mom! Mom! Aiden cut me in half again!
Nobody's good at everything, but everybody's good at something. What's your thing?
This introduction of the HST has been awful for the provincial economy because nobody can make a decision. Nobody knows where they stand. And this has dragged on for almost 2 years now. It has been a total cock-up.
So say all of us. Welcome back to Voice of BC. And we've got the Finance Minister on the show tonight. We did a bit of a go-around on the HST before the break. I've got a couple of more things on it that I want to raise. Get on to provincial budget. Start off with a question from Andrew McLeod from the Tyee, an issue that's come up several times with the HST. Here's Andrew.
Minister Falcon, one of former Finance Minister Carol Taylor's criticisms of the HST was that British Columbia would be giving up what she called our tax sovereignty, our ability to decide what we would and wouldn't put sales tax on. I'm wondering what you make of her criticism.
And the panel dealt with that issue too.
Yeah, they dealt with that issue and pointed out that in fact we haven't done that. Under the agreement we have with the federal government, we were able to adjust the rate We're able to provide tax exemptions within 5% of the GST base. In fact, it also limits what the federal government can do. They can't change the GST base or reduce it in a way that impacts us financially without compensating us. I think it's a fair agreement that actually looks after British Columbians' interests. So it just, it doesn't fly. That's not what's in the agreement.
The province can reduce the rate starting the 1st of July next year.
That's right, 2012.
So 2012.
And we can only reduce it once every year. You can't
to give them notice.
That's right.
And the other thing the province can do, which the panel points out, is what are called point of sale rebates.
That's right.
So essentially the province eats the tax at the cash register.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. You can't change the federal tax, but you can change the provincial.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. That's why it doesn't apply to gasoline, for example.
Well, we should hear from the Fight HST people at least once on the show. So here he is, Chris Delaney.
Minister Falcon, your government decided on a referendum for the HST rather than a free vote in the legislature because you said you wanted a full debate on the pros and cons of the HST. Many people don't believe you. They think you're just trying to wear out the public and try to keep the HST and collect as much as you can. If that's not true, will you accept my challenge for a debate in a full public forum so that British Columbians can hear both sides?
Well, actually, Vaughn, as you well know, we are provided $500,000 to the universities and colleges to sponsor a series of debates in every part of the province. One of the things I really don't want to do is actually try and politicize this and turn this into an issue where, government is trying to have a campaign around it. All I want to do as a finance minister is make sure public has basic information so they can make an informed choice. Mr. Delaney's going to be out there fighting for his side along with Mr. Van der Zam. They're going to be fighting and making the argument along with Adrian Dix that they want to return to a PST plus GST system. And then the Smart Tax Coalition, which is business and all the other groups that are part of their coalition, are going to fight the other side. I'll let the public sort through their persuasion efforts and they can have at it. What my responsibility as a finance minister, I believe, is make sure the public has basic facts in front of them so that they can make an informed choice. They can sift through the pros and the cons there. I'll let them do that.
If you want to know a little more, folks, about the referendum and what's going to happen, there's information now starting to be posted on the website for Elections British Columbia. Just Google Elections BC if you have a home computer, or go to the library and do it. They've started to post information on the ballot. They haven't gone out yet. Elections BC has ordered 13 million envelopes because it's going to take 4 envelopes to handle the mailing system so that you get a secret ballot. But all that will be going out to you in June, and you'll be able to order a ballot if you don't get one. If you want to know more background on that, check out the website. And I expect this will come up again on this show. I somehow or other think we'll be talking about it again. Let's go to a question from the NDP finance critic, Bruce Ralston, about the budget. Here's Bruce.
Earlier this spring, the previous finance minister, Colin Hanson, introduced a budget that he described as a status quo or no change budget. Your new leader, Premier Clark, has said that she's committed to change. How do you reconcile a no change budget with that commitment?
Well, I think first of all, it's not just a no change budget. I mean, there's an additional $605 million for healthcare. As you well know, there's increases in other ministries. What it is a very prudent budget reflecting the fact that we are still in uncertain economic times. And I think prudence is actually the watchword that we ought to be thinking about right now. And we also have, of course, this looming referendum on HST, which could have a dramatic financial impact on provincial revenues. So actually, I don't think now is the time to be doing a big change budget. I think now is the time to be prudent. I get that the finance critic for the NDP doesn't agree with that, and they're going to campaign for a tax that's going to result in a almost $3 billion hit to provincial tax revenues. But I'll let him defend that.
If you, if you lose the referendum, you may be in a position, you will be in a position of having to bring in another budget this fall, presumably, because the transition money comes in. but you're going to have to start dealing with getting the tax out of the system. So,
well, that's right. And
yeah.
so the first thing we'll have to deal with is the last tranche of transition money, just over $500 million, is actually payable in July. So, you know, depending on whether we receive that before the election results or what have you, I'm not sure how that'll work. But yeah, so I mean, we're going to have to deal with the fallout from that. Now, obviously, it does take time to unwind, as you know, but that's going to have to be reflected in our next budget, and we're going to have to look very carefully at what those impacts
I was reading over the agreement we signed with Ottawa the other day, and these the federal government, there's no question where the power is, right? If we break the agreement by getting rid of the tax, we don't have to write them a check for 1.6 billion. They just take it off our transfer payments.
Absolutely.
They can just take it. They just give us less money that month from Ottawa until it's paid, right? It's sort of like garnishing your wages.
Yeah,
so,
no, that's exactly right.
Obviously, a national government isn't going to screw a province. You're going to be able to negotiate it. But ultimately, if they decide they want the money,
they get the money. And, you know, look, I mean, it was an agreement. It was an agreement that said if we harmonize, you know, our PST with the GST, they will provide $1.6 billion in transition dollars to help us harmonize and get through that. And frankly, at that time, those were really important dollars. We were in an international economic meltdown. That helped us with the deficit. It helped us support healthcare, education, et cetera. So it was well needed.
Here's somebody else who's been looking over our budget, and he has a bit of a sense of unease about just how much room to move there is in that budget. Jock Finlayson.
The province's fiscal situation, I think, is more challenging than was indicated in the budget that Colin Hanson brought down in February. Some of the economic indicators are weaker than we've been expecting, and the budget in February had only a $350 million forecast allowance on a $40 billion budget. So the bottom line is the Christie-Clark government, I think, has relatively little room to move in terms of fiscal policy.
You right about that?
He's right about that. We also have a $600 million contingency, as you know, and we purposely made that large to reflect the uncertainty that is out there. And a lot of people said, oh, well, they got such a big contingency. And by the way, we have $450 million each year in the next 2 years in contingency, and we also have the $350 million forecast allowance. But that is about prudence, Vaughn, because I tell you, I am still very, very nervous about what I see happening around the world. The United States is, they are still sucking wind big time. And there's challenges in Europe. There's, Spain is running into, Portugal's got financial problems. There's sovereign debt issues. I mean, there are lots of challenges out there. And I think that in British Columbia, we worked hard to rebuild our AAA credit rating. I'm proud of the fact that we're only one of 2 provinces that have one, not like the 90s when it was knocked down multiple times under the NDP. And we're trying to be very prudent. And if I get criticized for being prudent, I'm okay with that.
Bob Simpson, the independent member of the legislature. Good question. Here's Bob.
There was much talk during the Liberal leadership campaign about the climate change objectives established by Premier Campbell, in particular the carbon tax. I wonder if the finance minister could tell British Columbians what is the future of the carbon tax. Is it going to continue? Is it going to be pulled? Is it going to be stalled? I think British Columbians deserve clarity on that.
Well, first of all, it's going up on July 1st, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's going to continue. We're very proud of the fact that we took a leadership role in climate change in British Columbia. I think, frankly, my only disappointment has been that no one else has followed us in that regard, because I really believe that if you genuinely are concerned about climate change and you genuinely want to do something about it, pricing carbon is absolutely the right thing to do. And, I look south of the border with all of the deficit and debt problems that they have in the United States. I think a carbon tax would be the single smartest thing they could ever do to deal with those challenges and also start to change behavior. I don't anticipate that's probably going to happen anytime soon in the United States, but British Columbia is proud of our leadership role, and we're going to continue to have a leadership role there. And I think the question really is, in 2012, what do we do going forward? Does it increase? Does it stay the same? That's a question where we have to have a discussion with environmental groups, the Pembina organizations and others. I just met with them earlier this week, but also with the business community, and say, if we keep increasing that threshold in British Columbia, what does that mean in terms of other jurisdictions and everything else? And that's a discussion we need to have with the public and the affected stakeholders, but we'll do that. But we're not abandoning it.
It goes up a couple of pennies a year per liter of gas, and it was put on a 5-year schedule, right? So the last installment is this time next
That's
year,
right.
2012.
That's correct.
And you haven't said what happens beyond that.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah,
it's,
and as you know,
it's on schedule till then.
Yeah, and as you know, this was irony here. We said this one was going to be revenue neutral too, as you recall.
Yes.
In this case, it's been anything but revenue neutral in the sense that over the next, just within this fiscal plan, I think we are giving out more than we're actually collecting in by about $760 some odd million. So I think it's actually been a pretty good benefit for families just in terms of the revenue neutrality part. Because of course you estimate that, and I think the tax reductions have outweighed the revenues received. But I still think it is absolutely the right thing to do, just in terms of showing global leadership in that regard.
Another running controversy. This is a big one, and I think it's growing. Medical service premiums. Gregory Thomas. Here's Gregory.
Since the last election, the BC Liberals have announced 3 successive hikes in medical service plan premiums. 19%, $240 for families with kids. How can you justify taxing a family in Cloverdale $1,536 when you don't pay the tax yourself, the Premier doesn't pay it, no BC public employee pays it?
Well, you know, I think when you think about MSP and you think about any increases we put, I mentioned this today in the House. You know, the NDP was saying, oh, the HST, what an impact, and you're hurting families. And I had to point out to them, if you go to our budget, as you know, Vaughn, you go to Appendix A3, and you will see the total tax burden on a typical BC family. It's got everything from a couple of seniors to, you know, a family of 4, family of 6. British Columbia, if you include MSP premiums, you include personal income taxes, property taxes, HST, all of the taxes combined, that British Columbia is the second lowest tax jurisdiction overall in the country. Alberta's slightly better than we are, but we are the second lowest, and I'm proud of that. So let's talk about MSP premiums. You know, and I've met with Gregory before. He says you should just get rid of all of them, the MSP premiums, and then you won't have to pay them for public servants. Well, it's an interesting idea, but I got to tell you, as a former health minister, and when we think about healthcare in this country, the only tie that we actually have right now where the public associates any cost whatsoever to all the healthcare services they receive is actually the MSP premium. And I got to tell you, I'm a little nervous about moving away and eliminating the one last connection, albeit indirect, that people can associate, you know, healthcare and having some cost associated with it. And we have, you know, for the family in Cloverdale, if they're, depending on what their income level is, as you know, we have low-income supports that will provide, eliminate all their costs or some of their costs, depending on what their income level is under the Fair Pharmacare program.
He's interesting on that, though. He was on the show a little while ago, and he said the Taxpayers Federation is going to talk about running a campaign against this, and they're going to highlight 2 things. First, they're going to highlight the inequity of who pays, because a bunch of people, and I'm one of them, have a deal with their employer where the employer picks up the premium, right? I never see the money. It's free. I don't pay medical premiums. It's a workplace benefit, and I suppose if I lost it, I'd want something in exchange for it. But nevertheless, and there's lots of people, lots of public sector union contracts, lots of private union contracts have that. So that was his first point. That some people pay and some people don't pay at all. Right. His second point, which I thought I hadn't realized this, he says, and you correct me on this one if he's not right about it. He says there's a separate collection apparatus run through the medical services plan to collect premiums from people who don't pay them. And it's an administrative cost, and he says they even get collection agencies, and he said it would be much more efficient if you simply rolled that as a tax into the tax base, collected the same amount of money, but you've already got a tax collection agency in the provincial administration. I think he makes a good case.
Yeah, and I met with Gregory recently, and he talked about it, and he's going to get me some more information on the idea. So look, I'm always open to listening to ideas, but I want to go back to what I said before. You know, I've been a health minister. I think one of the challenges we have in this country, frankly, is that healthcare is free. And, you know, when you have a free service, it tends to get unlimited use. And I think the challenge is if you don't have any tie-in whatsoever to the fact that there is some cost associated with all of these hugely enormous expensive services that people receive, I'm not sure that's good public policy, but I'm certainly open to listening to his ideas.
Well, that's going to be an interesting issue. I expect that one will come up again, too. We're going to take a brief break on Voice of BC with Finance Minister Kevin Falcon. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If our provincial government is to long-term benefit from forestry, from mining, from oil and gas, from agriculture, we need to see a significant reinvestment in staff in small towns like places like Horsefly, McBride, or be it Houston as soon as possible.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
As I'm driving to work, I can feel the anxiety building. My stomach starts to get sick. I start to sweat.
It's a feeling of terror, like a life and death situation, basically.
I always feel like I'm, under a spotlight.
I would kill myself at a certain point if things didn't get better.
Anxiety and depressive disorders are the most common of all mental illnesses. For a free mental health screening, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 and Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. To find out when Voice of BC rebroadcasts in all other parts of the province, please contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Kidney disease affects an estimated 2 million Canadians. Many don't even know they have it. But thanks to the Kidney Foundation of Canada's innovative programs and vital research, countless people have been able to turn to us to help them manage, delay, and in some cases even prevent the disease. We're the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Please support us. We're behind you all the way.
Clearly, the preference of the BC Liberal government, their priorities have been to impose regressive taxes on ordinary people. The HST is one, the medical service premiums tax is another, and yet claim that they're reducing the overall and bettering the overall financial situation of BC families. That's clearly just not the case.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. Next week on the show, let's see, the last time this guy was on the show, he was an independent. And before that, he was energy minister. And now he's no longer an independent. He's back in cabinet and he's the transportation minister, Blair Lekstrom. So he gets around. He was on a motorcycle outside the legislature buildings today. He does this every year, motorcycle safety. Getting a ride with Blair is the highlight for many a cabinet minister. I think this year's lucky rider was Shirley Vaughn.
Yes.
Yes.
And he's a real biker, too.
Oh, yeah, no, he's serious. And this is a guy who rides home to his riding in Fort St. John on his motorbike from Victoria. So, yeah, no, he's serious. Let's see, where was I? Okay, so Blair Lekstrom next week, Kevin Falcon tonight. And again, it wouldn't be an episode of this show without at least one question this year about BC hydro rates. Here it is, Jenny Kwan.
The hydro rate increases is going to be a significant hit for people in families and organizations, nonprofits and so on, for small businesses and trying to make ends meet. And the fact is that we're going to be seeing a hydro rate increase somewhere to the tune of some 50% over the next few years. So this is significant by way of an increase into your pocketbook, into your everyday sort of operations.
Where does the review of that stand?
Well, the review is underway, and as you know, the Premier Christy Clark directed the minister responsible and the Deputy Minister of Finance and Deputy Minister to the Premier and the Chair of Hydro to actually go back in, drill down, and look at all of their cost assumptions, look at the timing of when they're going to do these capital projects to see whether that impact can be ameliorated, and if so, by how much. Having said that, I think we need a bit of perspective. We have the second lowest hydro rates in North America. And frankly, I think for a long time, governments of all stripes are guilty of, frankly, not allowing hydro to make the kind of investments they ought to have been making for a lot of their capital, what I call sort of the historic investments that were made by W.C. Bennett, and the upgrades that are needed to keep ensuring we continue to receive those kind of benefits long term. And so the problem is when they want to go do that, and that's what they want to do in a relatively short period of time, that's going to be reflected in the price that consumers pay. So the Premier's directed, take a look at that, see if we can ameliorate some of those increases. That's what they're going to do, and I imagine we'll hear back. The Minister responsible is overseeing that effort.
You read through the hydro books at some of these projects that they're doing, and most of the money is being spent by hydro on its own.
That's right.
Either dams or generating facilities or transmission lines. A lot of earthquake proofing going on in there. Like we built that entire network back when British Columbians didn't really worry about the big one. Now that we do, there's a lot going on. A lot of that is just like dams and that are being strengthened and transmission lines
and not
stuff
just
like that.
not just earthquaking, but replacing turbines. I mean, these are massive. If you've ever gone through the WC Bennett Dam, as I have, and toured through it, it's like, wow, it's incredible. Actually, they built that in the '60s, isn't it? But I mean, yeah, they're huge investments, and they're necessary. No one from government is not saying they're necessary. I think the issue is we owe it to the public to make sure that we are doing everything we can to ensure that every additional dollar that's required to do those capital investments, that we are honoring and respecting the fact that these are taxpayer dollars that will pay for them. We want to make sure that those increases are really justifiable and minimized as much as possible.
Jock Finlayson with another question. We've got a new federal government. They have a deficit too, and they now have a majority. How are they going to get to a balanced budget without doing something to transfer payments, I guess, is the issue. In any event, here's Jock.
Every year, BC, like other provinces, gets substantial cash from the Government of Canada in the form of transfer payments. 5 years ago, we were getting about $5 billion a year from Ottawa. Currently, we're getting close to $7.5 billion a year that goes into the provincial government pot. My question is, how confident are you that the federal government will continue to increase those transfer payments, given that Ottawa is grappling with its own substantial budget deficit?
Very confident. The Prime Minister during the election campaign committed to continuing to increase the Canada Health Transfer, or the Canada Social Transfer, I think they call it now, by that 6% annual increment in the years ahead. I think that's very good. But look,
he also talked about getting some standards out of the money, though. Like he said, he wanted a little more result oriented.
Oh yeah, and you know what? I am all for that, because actually British Columbia has led the country, as you know, particularly in healthcare, in terms of not being afraid to innovate and drive for outcomes. We've got the best health outcomes in the country in almost every single measurement. So that's something that we're very comfortable with. We're innovating in terms of patient-focused funding. We're innovating in terms of sort of the disease prevention approaches that we've been taking. So I'm very comfortable with that. But look, at the end of the day, the federal government's in a great position because the provinces have all the big cost drivers. We've got the healthcare, we've got the education. Healthcare especially is the biggest cost driver. And the federal government, I think, has lots of opportunity. If you look at their spending rate increases over the last 5-6 years, they've been pretty significant. So I think they've got lots of opportunity, even if they just reduce their rate of spending growth to an inflationary amount. Boy, I'll tell you, I think they can deal with their deficit without too much trouble, and they can still honor the 6% increase.
Andrew McLeod again, Tyee P3s. Here's Andrew.
Mr. Falcon, for the last decade, the provincial government and Partnerships BC have been big promoters of public-private partnerships. I'm wondering now, where we have experience with cost overruns and other problems with some of them, including the Sea to Sky Highway, the Abbotsford Hospital, the Port Mann Bridge, I'm wondering if you've reevaluated that all and what your thoughts are going forward on the value of P3s.
Well, I have no idea what Andrew's talking about. Because
the P3 at Port Mann fell apart in the
financial
crisis.
Okay, so very different. So let's understand what we're talking about here. So Sea to Sky Highway, enormously successful. I mean, that was a project that was delivered ahead of schedule, on budget. In fact, we've got about $10 billion worth of P3s now. Canada Line's another good example, Vaughn. You remember as well as I do. What were the critics saying? It would never get built on time. It would never be on budget. We would never hit the ridership targets of 100,000 new riders a day. They were wrong on every count. Delivered ahead of schedule, delivered on budget, and we've shattered all the ridership targets. Now, in the case of the Port Mann Bridge, absolutely, we didn't actually go forward on a full P3 on the Port Mann Bridge because during the international economic meltdown, the capital markets froze up. And there was no way to do a responsible P3 during that time, so we didn't. And we've gone forward with more traditional design build, and I think that's appropriate. You have to make decisions that are sensible. But I can tell you this, you know, we should be doing more P3s. Look what happens when we don't. We didn't do the convention centers at P3, and we saw what happened there. Now, it was wildly over budget, but thankfully at least, it's built, it's there, and it will be repaid over the fact that it's a huge success. And so over time, we're going to get all that back. But that wasn't to P3. Look at the Capilano filtration project the GVRD is doing. I mean, it's years behind schedule. It's wildly over budget. Why? Because an NDP mayor named Derek Horgan fought to make sure that that wasn't going to be a P3. Why? Because the QP public sector unions don't support P3s. And now they've just, you know, hammered themselves and taxpayers with all the additional costs. So I am very pro private-public partnerships where they make sense.
Do you look at that new roof on BC Place in Vancouver and try to figure out how taxpayers are not going to get stuck with the entire cost of that? $500 million?
Well, first of all, taxpayers we've budgeted those dollars, so we're going to be paying for that. But I think it's interesting.
But I thought the money was supposed to come back by developing the land around there so that over 30 or 40 years it was self-supporting.
That's true. And it's not going to obviously be anchored by a casino anymore, but there are still lots of development options. I mean, that's primo real estate for residential, for office. There's lots of other options that they can look at. So, you know, they'll work with the City of Vancouver and figure out what is the right mix to, you know, develop whatever gets developed there, and that will generate revenues to the government and over time repay some of the costs. But I think it's important and instructive. I don't know if you saw that story about the steel, the steel supplier to the BC Place roof that was $25 million over budget. They had to eat it because of the way that...
a newspaper very dear to my heart had a headline on the story that suggested the government was eating it, but in fact it was the supplier.
That's right. And that's how we structure deals, where we transfer the risk to the private sector. They're better able to manage it, and when they don't, they eat it, as they did in that case.
Good question here from Ben Parfit. This issue comes up from time to time. The government offers discount incentives, if you want, relief from royalties to encourage development of oil and gas in the province. Ben wonders whether this is the right time to be doing that. Here's Ben.
The provincial government very clearly is dependent on revenues from the natural gas sector. Christy Clark has made it very apparent that she sees a linkage between those revenues and provision of healthcare services in the province. I'm just wondering, though, if it makes any economic sense for the provincial government to be providing incentives to the natural gas industry at this point in time to try and get them to pull more gas out of the ground when gas prices are so severely depressed.
Well, I think it's a reasonable question, and gas prices are really depressed in North America. But there's a big potential market for natural gas, liquefied natural gas in Asia. And, you know, as you know, they get a lot of their power through burning coal. And there's opportunities there for LNG exports that we haven't even begun to tap into. So, you know, I think you have to look at that industry and understand that the investments they make, they're looking to the long term. They know they're, you know, not getting good prices right now, but they're also looking at the world markets and where those, you know, where those opportunities might lie. I think the issue is balance. What you don't want to do is look what happened in Alberta, where they said, okay, we're going to, you know, crank up the hit on the industry. And guess what happened?
Best thing that ever happened to our oil and gas
Best thing that ever happened to our oil and gas sector, and we saw all the benefits, and they've now reversed all those decisions, and they're back being competitive again. So,
when are we ever going to get healthcare costs under control? Ask a former health minister turned finance minister, and here's the question, Jock Finlayson.
Minister, as someone who's now running the finance department, you've had the experience previously of being Minister of Health, where you were responsible for more than 40% of the government's budget. You know how quickly health spending has been rising all across Canada. My question is, as Minister of Finance, how confident are you that government can slow down the rate of increase in healthcare spending without severely compromising services to the public?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do, Vaughn, is we've got to do a pretty significant shift in how we think about healthcare. I am a big, big believer that if you think about the fact that 2/3 of the people that are in our hospitals today are there with one or more chronic illnesses, most of which are entirely preventable. by some fairly simple lifestyle changes. Ironically, the HST, as a former health minister, it now applies to junk food and it applies to fast food, and I don't actually think that's such a bad thing. And I hear that from I used to hear that from a lot of people, that when I was health minister, that, you know, that's what you ought to be doing, government, is help people to make good choices. And I got to tell you, I think there's a big opportunity for us to try and encourage the right behavior in the public, and do everything we can to encourage that, so that people can make lifestyle changes that can help avoid and prevent them from coming into our healthcare system, especially the hospitals, which is the most expensive part of our system. That's not going to deal with all the problems, but it's one of the ways, coupled with using innovation, patient-focused funding, driving better productivity within the system, because the advantage of a government-run system is there's often a lot of inefficiencies. And if you're not afraid to go after them, if you're not afraid to be innovative and bold, I think you can start to bend down that cost curve in healthcare and, you know, grow the economy at the same time and make it manageable. We're never going to see a day where we're spending less on healthcare in 1 year than we were the year before. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But if we can get the growth in healthcare to, you know, try and bend that growth curve down and grow the economy faster, then we've got sustainable healthcare. And I do think we can do that.
Iglika Ivanova has been reading the fine print of some of the government's promises. This is an interesting one, though, because it's been mentioned a few times. I don't think we've actually seen the details on this, but maybe I missed it. In any event, here she is.
If the federal children's fitness tax credit is any indication, the new provincial children's fitness and arts tax credit won't increase children's participation in these programs. What it will do is provide benefits to higher income families who can afford to send their children to programs without the tax credit. Low-income families who don't owe income tax won't benefit at all. Why not instead provide core funding to schools for sports and arts programs that all children can participate in?
So I wanted to include this one because this has been promised, but we haven't got the details on this yet. Is that the case?
That's right. You know, the Premier Christy Clark has talked about seeing whether we could, I think, you know, sort of on board with what the federal government's doing to try and encourage, you know, families to get their kids involved in fitness activities, et cetera. And we want to be smart about it. We want to try and do it right. I think the principle is absolutely right, and I really applaud the Premier for that. You know, but I think it's legitimate for the lady to point out, you know, some concerns she may have. And certainly, you know, the Premier and myself and government will want to get it right. And, you know, we're always open to trying to say, how do we best get it right? I do believe, and as a former finance minister, I know for sure that if you look at healthcare challenges, the lower socioeconomic classes are that is where you have the biggest challenges, particularly on First Nation reserves. And that's also the biggest opportunity to change behavior. So how do we do that? That may be one way of trying to deal with it for some segment of the population. We may need other strategies for lower income folks too.
Interesting thing that happened at the legislature this week. I don't think I've seen this happen in quite the same way before. Opposition leader tabled legislation. Normally, measures of legislation tabled by the opposition get read once and that's it, and they sit there because the government has its agenda. Adrian Dix, it was a bill to regulate the cosmetic use of pesticides. And the Premier came marching down the hallway into the government caucus and stopped and said, you know what, that's a good idea, we should do that. Everybody kind of breath was sucked in all around. You know, I mean, this doesn't happen very often. Nice, though, to think once in a while the government would acknowledge the opposition had a good idea.
Yeah, and I really commend the Premier for that. I mean, that's the kind of new type of leadership that I think is a breath of fresh air. That this is a Premier that's not afraid to say, you know, we don't pretend to be the fountain of all great ideas, and if there's another good idea that comes from the opposition, let's work with them and see if we can't develop public policy that is just built on good ideas, wherever they come from. You know, that's all. I've got to tell you, Vaughn, in every ministry I've ever been in, I've always said, you know, some of the best ideas come from pretty unusual places. Let's steal the best ideas from around the world or wherever and put them into good public policy. That's what she's doing.
I like to think the opposition is sitting there sharpening their pencils and working on their ideas, and maybe we'll see more of these. Thank you to Kevin Falcon for being on the show. Appreciate your time, as always. Next week on Voice of BC, Blair Lekstrom, our Transportation Minister. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.